Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you're at. My name is Jim Lucas with the Evanston Consulting Group. I've done a lot of work in the area of packaging and product innovation. And so today we're going to be talking about clean labeling. And really this is a little bit different than some other things we've seen in the past where the focus here, unlike other regulatory things, if you will, is that we're trying to focus on what consumers want. And this will play a large role in terms of what the opportunity is around clean labeling. Today's consumers are drawn to brands naturally and products that equip them to live healthier, fuller, longer lives. And so what's starting to happen is that people are looking for, seeking out things that sort of fit with how they're trying to approach the world. But things like product recalls, allergy scares, and harmful added ingredients in many of the products that are in today's store shelves, right, are a serious concern to consumers of all demographic stripes. So there's a desire for clean labeling. As we'll see, it starts to emerge. Question really now, the opportunity really is to deliver on that sort of desire, if you will. So a good way to classify shoppers today are concerned but confused. So if we take a look at the segmentation of the marketplace, probably somewhere between 55 and 60% of shoppers can be classified as concerned but confused. So most people feel that packaging nutritional information is important, right? And almost 40% of the people, consumers, trust what companies are saying on their labels. But we also see that about 37% are confused by the claims on their food packaging, right? So this makes for an interesting kind of question, right? More than 70% on a survey that was done by BFG that reported in Fast Company, right? Respondents said that they agree that food labels were meaningless, right? So that there's a problem with it. But at the same time, 37% of them still trusted it. So there's a great opportunity inside here to sort of build this trust so that it doesn't go as unrequited trust, if you will. Now, we're going to talk for a few minutes about truth smuggled. So much of the challenge around product labeling can be thought of as truth smuggling, right? So that don't mean necessarily that the manufacturers are trying to get a fast one over on people, but rather what we're starting to see that it's sometimes difficult to communicate about these things based on regulatory language that can be used, all that kind of stuff. But also, if you think about how consumers try to extract meaning from it, so sometimes it might be from the technical language that people are not able to easily understand what's going on, or the information they're looking for may not be there. Or finally, one of the things we started to see that plays a large role here is that people sort of have some meaning they want these things to have. And so that sort of affects the way they sort of go through. So we're trying to, the truth is struggling to come through. We're trying to make sure that we can try to smuggle it in somehow in the good way, or at least to tell the truth at a slant, as Emily Dickinson would say. So again, what we said is consumers are confused but concerned, okay? And so as we go through here, we're going to try to look at a little bit of this and take it apart. One thing I wanted to mention as we head into this is we've looked at a couple of different ways in which people have been successful at looking at and developing clean label. So we're going to talk about some of the things here that we think are playing a role here that has sort of set this up. So in the first place, what we've seen is, again, going back to this truth smuggling, organic is not so simple, right? So while we know that almost 70% of people report buying organic meat, poultry, dairy, or fruit and vegetables, right? Only about 20% of them can correctly identify how the USDA defines organic. Right? So, a good portion of them knew that it wasn't chemical additives, there were no chemical additives or GMOs inside there. But one of the questions that starts to emerge is that almost 3/4 of the people say that organic has simply become a marketing tool. Or 53% of the people don't trust a product labeled as organic is actually organic. So there are there are some trust issues inside there. There's also some understanding issues inside here, and we'll see that this is the case across a number of these. A second area we looked at was, and this again came out of the Fast Company article, and was based on a BFG survey of about 300 people, most of whom were under the age of 35. Okay, so it gets us to one of the key segments in millennials. But what we're seeing here is that natural is unnaturally confusing. So about 41% of the people in the survey believe that natural is better for you. About 37%, almost the same amount, believe that natural is not better for you. And 63% agree that natural is a marketing term. So as we start to think about these kinds of clean label issues, one of the questions we need to think about is how can we proceed as sort of having the consumer, the shopper's best interests at heart without sort of appearing only to be sort of spewing out marketing buzz mumbo as we go through these things. Another area that is an interesting one, and this was actually on Jimmy Kimmel at some point, where you see is about GMOs. And so what we've seen is that 59% of the shoppers or consumers are concerned about GMO food products. We see that 32% of them know how to define a GMO food product. 21% did not know how to define it. And it's interesting, if we look at this, if we look at a breakout of males versus females, what we see is that females are more concerned but less likely to be able to define it. Males are a little bit less likely to be concerned about it but are better able to define it. So the truth, if you will, is struggling to come through, and I think that there are a lot of ways in which you can start to help shoppers and consumers with this truth, if you will, going forward. And then finally, one of the things we want to take a quick look at was no sugar added. Now, this is a term that's kind of fascinating because this is probably the one in which people's wish, if you will, are the things that are probably most tainting the meaning of any language that appears even on packaging or in marketing touch points, right? So 31% believe that no sugar added means that it has lower sugar content, so kind of it would be like reduced sugar, and 13% believe that it's sugar-free. So you can see that the trying to break through with the truth is going to have some challenges as we start to look at both shoppers and the regulatory language as we go through. So what's happened is this is, as we're faced with this impenetrable jungle of declarations about health and nutrition claims and additives and so forth, consumers are having difficulty coping with all this. And so we've seen a rise of clean labels. How can consumers decide what's healthy and free of unnatural additives? That's really the question that we're trying to help them address. And when it comes to these food, purchases and nutritional labels, consumers want it one way, their way, which is clean. And what we started to see is that almost a fifth of the U.S., somewhere between a fifth and a fourth of the U.S. would like to see improved labeling on packaging that makes it easier for them to identify healthier food products, if you will. Okay, so this is sort of setting the stage for where we think we need to head with some of this stuff. So as clean labeling has emerged as a concept, right, it's gained a lot of traction in recent years because of the need for better transparency that's grown out of, and it's unlikely to fade given the FDA's upcoming nutritional label regulations that are going on. Now, clean labeling has probably received a little bit more attention in recent years in places like Europe, right? So there's some history, there's some benchmarking we can start to look at as we think about things like clean labeling. But unlike terms like organic or natural, there's not really a legal definition about the term clean label. There's probably not a registered trademark that one can use for this or a label of sorts, right? So this has been something that's more about the spirit of what consumers are looking for. And again, this has been one of the key things here is it's been determined by consumers, and it's one of the key elements here that we need to focus on throughout is like listening to what consumers think about this. And at no point in time have we probably been better placed to do so. You think about all the social listening we can leverage and really good ways to interact with consumers and get a really good notion of what they're expecting. Right. So consumers have a desire for straightforward food labeling, lists exactly what ingredients are in or not in a product. Right. They're clear, complete, accurate depiction of the product that people are considering purchasing. So if we go back up to our notion of how can people make really good choices, we're trying to help them do that. And so really probably the most important thing about this is we believe that clean label represents an opportunity or a chance really to match consumer expectations. So, it gives us a chance to sort of be leaders. It gives us a chance to sort of guide the discussion, if you will, right, or the agenda, because part of it is it's coming from consumer expectations. So if we can start to address those consumer expectations, there's a really good chance that we can start to build our relationship with consumers going forward. So how might clean labels on packaging help build deeper trust-based relationships with consumers? Well, there are a couple of things that really are taking place here, right? One is that we're trying to make sure that we are going to sort of be able to clarify, right? Give them a clear, complete, and accurate depiction of the product that they're considering. The second thing here is that we want to start to incorporate more consumer-friendly, ideas into this, both in terms of how it's organized, how it's presented, the language we use, etc. And there's some key components that we've seen that are successfully applied across product lines in both food and beverage category by brands and retailers alike. I'd probably argue right now that I think that the retailers using their own brands with a little bit more control have generally had a little bit in the lead in terms of what they're able to do with clean labeling. But there are a number of examples that have come across that are quite good even by some of the manufacturing brands. So in a sense, there are probably three things we're trying to do with to build this truth-based relationship with consumers. So first of all, we're trying to make sure that this is a chance to enhance the quality of your product and build your perceptions about health and wellness, and how safe it is, how good it is for somebody. Second of all, this starts to become a way for helping to meet the needs that people have in terms of what they're trying to do. And third, it starts to become one of these things that almost starts to, we can sort of anticipate, the guidelines that are likely to go, and we can sort of preempt those as we go forward. So that's a way in which we can start to direct the agenda, if you will. So what are some of the things that make for a successful clean label? And really the key here is that the spirit of this, rather than the letter of it, is to align with consumers' needs and desires. So let me just walk through a couple of things here that we've started to see out here. Right, so consumers are trying to figure out what they're eating. And if you've ever gone through this, if you had yourself or a family member who's either developed some kind of allergies, in our household we've got some extremely sensitive gluten folks, so we have to look at the gluten stuff and monitor quite closely, right? Or if you had somebody who's a diabetic, you can think about all the instances that would sort of drive you to try and do this. And so what you're sometimes left doing is you're trying to figure out how can we get to the right foods for folks. So brands and retailers have not provided enough information that makes it easy to understand nor readily access this stuff, right? So accessibility becomes a really key part of it. And accessibility really has two dimensions to it. So one is the language being used, right? So accessibility, and what's good about clean labels, there are ingredients that I can understand, right? If there are things I might find in my cupboard, then they're really good. If there are things that have long chemical names or are difficult to understand, it starts to become somewhat problematic for me as a consumer. So as I'm trying to understand if these products will fit my household, right, I want to make sure that I understand how all these things are occurring. And this is starting to occur inside a changing environment as well, in terms of how people are using, how manufacturers are looking at their ingredients. Okay? So therefore, what we're saying is a clean label should be easy to find and read and should not require the use of additional resources to decipher its contents. Okay. Now, we see a great example of this is Wegmans, which they participate in Facts Up Front, which is an initiative that goes beyond Wegmans, that presents key information such as calories, saturated fat, sodium, and sugar on the front of the packaging, so that when somebody looks at it immediately at the shelf, it's large, it's easy to read, and easy to understand. And so this starts to become a key part of this. Now, one other point I wanted to make about accessibility is that we've seen that between 30 and 35% of food and beverage product page views are being accessed from mobile devices. So while the packaging is picking up the brunt of the pressure here and are bearing the brunt of this in terms of what's going on, I think that webs or apps are things that can really start to play a huge role in terms of how people look at this. And they don't necessarily need to look at a product every single time they go through, but what they're going to use is some help here, and it starts to become a really good way to provide accessibility and provide a little bit more information if someone needs it. And we've also seen there are a number of other folks that are participating in Facts Up Front, both on the national brand side and on the retailer side. But again, what this is starting to do is it's providing accessibility and ease of access, if you will, is a key part of this. A second key thing we've seen that is an important factor in terms of being successful is transparency. And I think an easy way to look at this is transparency puts your relationship with your shoppers and consumers first, and owning it for better or for worse So you could think about the analogy of if you have children, young children, and they have to do things, you think about how you need to take care of them, and you need to do that same thing. So transparency here is kind of like that. We need to own up for our kids, if you will, in a sense. But transparency is also an opportunity, right? So it's not just a challenge. It's not just a headwind. It's an opportunity here. And so we think it's an interesting opportunity to do something that's different, that's refreshing, right? Providing shoppers and consumers with the information that they need, with the information that they want. If your product includes an ingredient that's not quite good for such, so like added sugar, include that in your packaging, explain why. And maybe you can use your website or some other places to maybe give a little bit of a reason for why some of this is occurring. So we've seen in some of the soft drinks, they've been talking about cane sugar has been a positive thing that people have been talking about. So there's a couple of ways to sort of look at it that start to become good. This can provide you with a way to gain both consumers' trust and to gain some ground on your competition if they're not doing the same thing. It's also not just about compliance, but it's about finding opportunities to pay it forward, because, again, you're not mandated to do clean labeling, but, it's what's best for the consumer. And so if we can start to be perceived in that light, then we will be advancing our relationships with those consumers. And they know they can then start to come to depend on and trust what we're telling them with our packaging. So it's a really good, win-win for both sides of that equation. Simplicity is also one of the key things here. And again, consumers, probably like everybody else, crave simplicity, right? They're inclined to purchase products that contain 100% natural, traditional, familiar ingredients, right? So, in today's world, this is becoming a complex challenge for a lot of the retailers, manufacturers, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to find, for example, replacements. So if you look at some of the things that have been some of the preservatives in the past, like calcium propionate, right? So it's something that's used in a lot of baked goods. Okay, there's not a simple drop-in solution to that, right? So often you have to put other things in there. But what we've seen a lot of brands do is they've started to put in ingredients that are much more simple. So you think about, instead of using calcium propionate, people will use things like raisin juice or cultured wheat flour or vinegar. So those may all appear on there, may make the list a little bit longer, but I think they make it a little bit simpler. So there's a couple of ways to do that. The second thing we see if we look here is marketers can expect consumers to buy based not just what's in a product, but also what's not in a product as well. And so if we looked at something like Naked Juice, right, and what they've done with some of their smoothies, they seem to have got it right. So if you look at here, this is a Green Machine label you'll see over here on the right. You can see it is 2.75 apples, half a banana, I think it's a third of a kiwi, and so on. And so you can start to see it starts to make that very easy to go through. I love especially the hint of pineapple. And then I think it's things like Siggy's, right, which does the Icelandic style yogurt, right, and they've done a pretty good job there of having a fairly simple ingredient list, right. So what we're seeing is that the use of familiar traditional ingredients appeal to consumers' need for simplicity in food products that they purchase. And I would probably argue that the folks who have done the best job of this are probably the yogurt category in general. So they've done a very good job of and smoothies have done a very good job of going through here and doing this. One of the things that I find fascinating is, to me, is I'll call it fewer villainous ingredients, okay? So it's not a technical term, but I think what we're seeing is that people are looking for, in the simple, natural, organic, they're looking for fewer things that sound like chemicals or sound like harmful chemicals, okay? And what we're starting to see is that a number of retailers have started to take a leading role on this kind of stuff, especially in their refrigerated, especially in their prepared foods, if you will, right? So refrigerated and frozen. A couple of good examples of this are, I think, Kroger's Simple Truth and Simple Truth Organic. And if you were to look at the website for Kroger, you'll see that it's free from 101 different things that ingredients that that consumers, Kroger shoppers, told Kroger that they did not want in their food. So there's a whole list of those things down there if you look in the lower right, which sort of tells you what the free from is about. We're also seeing a similar kind of thing in terms of Whole Foods, where Whole Foods has if you look at their quality ingredients list, right, for foods, there are like 78 ingredients that are unacceptable for food products inside Whole Foods. And so, they actually been sort of accepted in a lot of cases as one of the gold standards as well, one of the benchmarks for this. But you can see that Kroger's starting to do a really good job of this as well. So people are starting to understand and have a better understanding based on these kinds of efforts about what is literally inside their food. So let me come to a little bit of conclusion here, and then we can open it up for some questions. What we're seeing in terms of clean labeling is that, and some final thoughts here really, is that clean labeling is an opportunity. Okay, so so we want to start. So it's important to start the conversation now, right? So if you want to be sort of determining the agenda, if you want to sort of be driving or directing the agenda about where this could go, then this is a great time to do it, because you can start to see that folks like Kroger and Whole Foods and Naked and Siggy and a whole host of other folks are starting to take some leads on this, and I think it starts to make a lot of sense, and it becomes an opportunity to, again, as we say, build that trust with consumers. Second point, a little bit more complicated, is that as companies experiment with new and engaging ways to incorporate clean labeling into their marketing mix, that I sort of called it more broadly, is it's evident that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Okay, so provide fundamental product information across touch points, right? And so we're going to say here that we think that the heavy lifting is, of course, going to be done by packaging, but there are other things like product websites, social media, all these kinds of things that will play a role as you go through here, including all of them can start to play a role, and so we might want to think about how those different things can work together. So the packaging doesn't have to carry the entire burden of this detail. It can be used in some very useful, accessible ways through things like the websites or reviews, etc. Second thing is that product information should be in an easily digestible form. So we talked about making it accessible. We talked about making it transparent. We talked about making it simple and fewer villainous ingredients. That's kind of a simple it's kind of a simple rule of thumb, right, for how to sort of make sure that it's in a digestible format. Some other things to be thinking about, okay, if there are things that I can sort of readily recognize as things I've seen before or heard before or might find in my pantry, fantastic, and try to minimize the things that I have not seen or heard before. Another key thing here we think is really to leverage consumer-generated content to help in two ways. One is it helps us understand what consumers' perceptions of a brand or product of an issue are. And so by using things like social listening, we think that it's really played a huge role in terms of what can be done to help consumers as they go through. But also, when you look at some of the reviews that consumers do, right, it really starts to give people a really important dimension to the issues that they're likely to face. Oh, here's something that came from somebody as a severe gluten intolerance, or as a dairy intolerant, or suffering from something like, let's say, diabetes, right? So those are all things that are key things to sort of go through and start to establish some relevance around it. And then finally, we think that by supplementing the standard information with authentic, right, consumer-generated content, again, generally consumers feel much more comfortable listening to, people, want to know if people feel comfortable listening to strangers much more so than experts or marketers or whatever. So we think that those are all key things that could be leveraged inside here. And then finally, the last 2 points are brand product doesn't have to be perfect to make a lasting impression on shoppers and consumers. In point of fact, what starts to happen is if you start to make the effort, if you start to establish that relationship with people, you'll start to get the benefit of the doubt, if you will, along the way. So everybody knows that, all consumers know that brands aren't perfect, they can't be, but I think it's taking that first step that will really start to get you a lot of leeway, a lot of consideration down the road. And finally, we think this is, importantly, is a chance to match consumer expectations. And, we wanted to make sure that we made it clear to consumers that we have their best interest at heart, and this is an opportunity to reconcile and refocus on a more meaningful relationship with them, right? So, again, we want to be authentic about this. We want to make sure that we are indeed addressing the issues that consumers have as we go through here. So I'm going to open it up to some questions now. Thank you for your time today, and I'm going to open this up to some questions now. All right, sorry. So one of the questions that came up I've been texted here is, does clean labeling represent a new form of regulatory guidelines? And point of fact, probably clean labeling is not a regulatory set of of restrictions. What's going to happen is, what it's going to do is it allows us to get in front of the game. It allows us to meet the needs of the consumer. So in that sense, it represents an opportunity rather than this kind of regulatory or legal hurdle that we have to overcome. So it's a great opportunity in terms of what it means as marketers, as brands, as retailers try to revamp or try to bring their relationship with the brand forward. So it's an interesting opportunity as we go through. Okay, so one of the questions is, how does clean labeling relate to the upcoming FLMA? I think one of the questions is going to be that as we go through here, so I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but let me try to elucidate a little bit, right? I think clean labeling is going to influence the agenda as we go through and look at all these things, right? Because what's going to happen is that the way that it's going to influence things is, if you look at who people will start to benchmark against, if you look at who people are using as the standard bearers, what we'll start to see is that people who are leading the way today will probably play a large role in that. So I think it starts to be important to maybe be at the table, to be heard, to put your voice forward about your category or about your brand, if you will, and that becomes a way to sort of get on the agenda. So I think in that sense, it probably becomes a really key way to get on the agenda, if you will, and help determine what's going on. A third question we had is, how does clean label play out across different channels in addition to packaging? Okay, and again, as we mentioned, packaging is the workhorse here. It's carrying the brunt of the burden, but it also shouldn't be doing that alone. And I think examples from both Kroger and Whole Foods markets were ones where you could start to go in and look at the ingredients and things that are now excluded from all their products. So it started to give you a really good way of understanding what that meant when they said it's free from 101 things. Also, I think what it does is it allows consumers to access more things, right? So most consumers are going to be somewhat skeptical of what we can think of as marketing-driven or brand-driven or product-driven or retailer-driven messages, right? So they're going to, by giving them some access not only to more information that can describe it inside the website, if you will, let's say, we also want to see if there are some things that we can start to do that help, that are going to help bring this across other things. So whether we're using social media, right? So that's one of the key things that we see that people are doing a great job of looking to when they're looking for reviews or looking for ratings or whatever. Okay. And then one of the questions is about any consumer insights regarding labeling of alcohol drinks. You think consumers read calories information? Okay. I think they do. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, beverages are probably this unusual area now for a lot of reasons, right? So you got all kinds of things going on with sugar. But if you look at what's happened with things like Skinny Girl, just as an example of that, right? They have done a very good job. They've been quite successful at producing a product that is, I think it's about 15 to 20% fewer calories, if you will, than some other things. So, it sort of gets you to a point of maybe being able to, get to a place where you can consume in a way that you want to, right? So, you've seen all those, you can remember all those commercials where they sort of show what you could do if you drank something other than a Skinny Girl. So I think they've been quite successful in terms of, driving this forward. And I think, some of that labeling plays a key role when you look at what's happened when they, Skinny Girl has usually done things like family displays, if you will, of different products. So it gave you a really good way to understand how people are looking at this particular category, and it really has revamped the category in a big way. Okay, so one of the questions is that came up is clean labeling more or less relevant across different price tiers, and particularly opening price points. So this probably is referring mostly, I would say, to store brands. But here's one of the things we started to see in terms of the evolution of what's going on with store brands inside here. It's going on beyond the opening price point. So what we're seeing is that almost across the sorry, let me start at the beginning, right? So there are a couple of, price tiering usually starts opening price point or the economy level being sort of the biggest, the first range, and then you sort of work your way up till you get to things like premium, okay? And so what we started to see in probably the last 2 years, I would say, is that increasingly retailers around the globe, so you can think about and go down the whole list of these folks. You can think about people like Tesco and Asda and, Walmart, and you can think about folks like Wegmans and Publix, et cetera. What they've started to do is they've started to infuse some of this clean labeling into their products up and down the range. So in a sense, you can think about they have been working on redefining value in such a manner that, this is a really good price, and by the way, it happens to meet a number of these other constraints I have when I'm trying to go through and consume things. So what we're seeing is that increasingly the retailers are turning to this as a way to differentiate their product, and it seems to be occurring up and down the price, the price tiering. But again, I think probably the key thing that's probably driving, the pricing, if you will, is it's going to drive the interest is going to be prices up. Of course, going to be a big thing when we talk about the economic range or the opening price point. Okay, so one other question that came here is do we think the government will step in? Interesting question here, and I think that's why it could, but I think one of the things that we're hopefully seeing is a more enlightened government group. And if we look around what's happening currently in terms of a lot of the organizations that are sort of focused on this, and we take also a cue from some things that have gone on in places like Europe, which has been a little bit more stringent about these things and a little bit more forward-seeking or thinking about it. Right, the government may want to take the lead of some other folks, and I think they would be happily willing to do that. If you thought about, again, as you said, some of the folks like a Kroger or a Whole Foods, or I think about a Yoplait or Chobani or Siggy, all these folks have been doing a very good job about trying to put things together that are going to set the agenda. And I think they help define things like clean labeling. So I don't think that clean labeling needs to get to the point where it'll be a registered trademark or that it'll have other language. But I think, like by incorporating the way that consumers or that shoppers think about this stuff into what clean labeling means, sort of keeps it relevant in a really important way. And I think that's going to be one of the key things. So again, I can't emphasize enough that I think that clean labeling is not something that we probably would want the government to sort of weigh in and come up with regulatory language about, but rather would want it to be sort of the spirit rather than the letter of that idea. And again, that's providing consumers with the stuff they need to be able to make decisions about what kinds of products they want. Okay, and then do you see clean labeling as something that will also benefit the brand owner as it pertains to their e-commerce activity? Absolutely. I mean, I think clean labeling can benefit anybody, and you can. Let me use an example of a couple of these, but I think it starts to create a brand aura, if you will, or brand equity if shoppers, if consumers know they can turn to you and feel pretty good about what you're doing. So you think about something like Naked we talked about, or Innocent in the UK, or you can start to think about what we've seen with all these yogurts, right? What they are starting to do is they are starting to leverage this kind of stuff. And I think, if they're doing e-commerce, and again, I'm not quite sure, e-commerce has a lot of range to it, but it's especially valuable in what I'll call the value creation side of e-commerce, which is how do I get people to the point where they can understand what the value is behind this thing. I think that's fantastic because it's a great way to differentiate one brand from some of the competition that's there. I think it also becomes a way in which probably people would use it as a checklist, if you will, as they go through and start to say, yep, I'm going to purchase this, I'm going to search, and these are the things that will make it easy for me to choose this. So you think about some of the online shopping you do with something like Peapod or whomever, you can start to sort those things in a lot of different ways. So it starts to become very valuable in terms of what you can start to look at and build your brand equity. Another question is, can truthfulness or transparency negatively affect a brand? Any examples of brands who have succeeded or failed with this? Transparent, I mean, again, I think, let's use an example. Okay, so kind of an interesting one is Twinkie, right? So Twinkies have been quite successful in their rebirth as they've gone through. And part of what they tried to do is they actively put this together and built it up. I think they paid $5 billion for it and ended up it's now valued at like $486 billion or something like that. Right? They tried to move away from a couple of things that were there they thought were harmful in the past. And so the transparency, in a sense, is we're trying to shed light on something that they've changed about it, right? So in that sense, it can be a really good thing if you start to do something with your product where you started to change it, and you want to get positive credit for that, so to speak, from your groups. Okay. I don't know if I have a lot of examples of people who have failed at this, but I think that the moving forward and trying to provide transparency is something that generally is received pretty well with consumers. And even some of the research that's been done in a number of different markets has suggested that people are willing to, be more loyal, but also in some cases willing to pay more for these kinds of things. But I think that's really the key part of this is, truthfulness, transparency can really positively affect the brand and the relationship with your shoppers. Okay. Well, thank you one and all for your time. I appreciate it. I know everybody's very busy. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And thank you for the great questions, a really good series of questions there that were fantastic. And we will also, both of these are available, as you can see below here, in terms of the presentation is available on SlideShare. And you'll see that clean labeling. There was an article that was done initially in Store Brands, can be found at the following link there. Okay. So I want to thank you all again and say goodbye. Thank you.